Hello, good afternoon. My name is Rebecca Nowacek. I'm the Director of External Partnerships here at Secure Families Initiative. For those that don't know, our organization is a nonpartisan organization composed of family members of those currently serving in the US military. We're honored to host today's briefing with our coalition partners at American Council of the Blind, National Council of the Blind, Tusk Philanthropies, and Senator Brad Hoylman and Assemblymember Harvey Epstein. We are here today because the current voting system leaves the ballot box inaccessible for certain New York voters. Today, we will be discussing legislation that will allow eligible New York service members, their families, and those voters with disabilities who need accommodations to securely submit their absentee ballot electronically. You will be hearing important stories about the challenges that military voters and voters with visual impairments face the ballot box, as well as election security experts and those who have implemented this process in other jurisdictions. So before we get started, a few things to keep in mind for today. We have a large group, which is wonderful. So I just want to encourage everyone to keep themselves on mute unless they're speaking. We expect to keep this briefing to an hour, which I understand can be ambitious. So we will have time for questions and answers at the end of our brief. If you have a question as the speaker is giving remarks, feel free to hold on to it until the question and answer section, or you can write it in the chat. My colleague Kate is here and she's compiling all the chat questions, and then I'll ask them out loud to our speakers at the beginning of the Q&A. We're going to encourage all questions to be limited to the legislation we're speaking to today, which is Bill 5729 on the Senate side and 0528 in the Assembly. Just a reminder, we are recording and we will share this recording and the transcript after today. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Senator Hoylman for his remarks.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to see everyone and really appreciate that opening, Rebecca. State Senator Brad Hoylman Siegel here. Very proud to be here with you all today to learn about this important legislation I carry with Assemblymember Harvey Epstein. I want to thank the Secure Families Initiative, the American Council of the Blind, the National Federation for the Blind, and Tusk Philanthropies for gathering us here together and being such a supportive ally of this bill. You know, over the last few decades, federal legislation has protected the rights of overseas military and disabled voters to cast a ballot easily and privately in the United States. Since 1986, you may know, the Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act has guaranteed the right of military and overseas citizens to register and vote by absentee ballot in federal elections. And the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, has promised equal access to voting for citizens with disabilities since 1990. But despite these landmark pieces of federal legislation, disabled military and overseas voters continue to face hurdles in casting their absentee ballots easily and privately. And according to the GAO, almost 2/3 of inspected election day polling places nationwide in 2016 had at least one impediment to people with disabilities, over 20 years after passing the Americans with Disabilities Act. That's unacceptable. Our legislation would bring New York State in line with over 30 states that already allow some form of electronic absentee ballot submission by requiring the New York State Board of Elections to set up an electronic absentee ballot submission system for overseas military, disabled voters, and disabled voters. And according to the Federal Voting Assistance Program, 74% of civilians voted in 2020, but only 47% of uniformed service members and only 8% of overseas citizens voted. Really, today in the 21st century, we should do everything we can to reduce barriers at the ballot box for New York voters, wherever they may be and however they may choose to vote. So I want to thank everyone for being here. I hope we can, advance this issue. I'm very proud to be chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and will be working with my colleagues to see if we can get this bill through the relevant committees and the Senate and onto the floor for a vote. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Senator. We really appreciate your support. And before I move on, I just want to make sure that, you know, on the other side, on the Assembly side, this bill is also being carried by, as the Senator mentioned, Assemblymember Epstein. I wanted to give a few seconds here in case the Assemblymember is in the room, or if anyone from his team would like to share.
I see him. He's here.
I'm right here.
I'm looking. There's so many people.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you for hosting this, and Brad, of course, thank you for all your partnership just on this bill and on so many others that we work on. It's really critical that this is a broad coalition from organizations, American Council for the Blind, obviously National Federation for the Blind, cybersecurity experts. We're all here to talk about the same thing. We want to encourage and then create incentives for allowing people to vote. I'm really proud to be a sponsor of this bill, which would reduce the barriers to voting. Senator Hoylman talked about statistics. Think about practically what's going on in our country. People are using their cell phone devices to do everything today. You are getting, like, you can get on an airplane with your mobile device. You can do your banking with your mobile device. You can, when you're overseas, there's so many things you can do, but you can't vote. And so the reality is that people who are in active military service, people with disabilities, people who are overseas for long term are really being excluded from the election process. If 30 states in the United States can do better, I don't know why New York can't. But we have to come out of the Stone Ages here. We have to know that it isn't just everyone's just going to go into a voting booth and pull a lever anymore. That's just not the reality. The reality is people should be voting from where they are. And especially people who have so many barriers to vote to begin with, especially people with disabilities, people permanently overseas. We want to ensure that they're a part of the election process, that their votes matter, their values matter. And that's exactly what this bill is seeking to do. Now we're here at the end of the legislative session. For Senator Hoylman is actually over. Senator Hoylman's cycle is actually over for me. I have another week to go before we're finished. But what we need to be doing is really spending the next 6 months together talking about why this is critical. You know, Zooms like this are so important because over the next 6 months, we're going to have to convince chairs of committee, our colleagues in government, advocates across the board to say why, the technology's there. People fill out for unemployment online. People provide other access to other government services for public benefits online. This is just one of many things people are doing. We know it can be safe and secure, and we want to ensure we have as much access as possible. And that's why we're here, and that's why we're sponsoring this bill and looking forward to its passage next year.
Thank you so much for those remarks. We know here at SFI that supporting legislation like this will really help members of the military community, as you spoke to, more easily participate in the very democracy that our families are committed to protect. So to speak about how this bill will ease challenges for military voters in New York, I would like to introduce Sarah Streyder, the Executive Director of Secure Families Initiative. Sarah.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Hi, everyone. It's a privilege to meet you. Like Rebecca said, I'm the ED here at SFI. And I wanted to give a bit of texture and color as to how this issue intersects with our voters. For starters, as you can imagine, the most vulnerable voters within our military family community are those who get stationed overseas. When you rely on voting through the mail to cast your ballot, there can be mail delivery delays that are entirely out of your hands. In 2020, we had families stationed in Japan where it took 6 to 8 weeks on average for mail to arrive. And you can imagine how impractical that made voting for a lot of those families. So while vote by mail is crucial and important, on its own, it is insufficient for us to reach a full 100% voter franchisement for military families. Policies like the 45-day advance window is helpful, but doesn't completely solve. as is electronic ballot delivery, gets us again closer, but doesn't help, especially if you don't have access to a printer, which when you're moving around the world, you don't always have the room to bring one with. And of course, there are folks overseas who have even added barriers. There are military families who get stationed overseas who are not attached to a military base or even a US embassy. We had a family stationed in Canada who had no access to US mail and therefore had to pay a $60 courier fee just to cast her ballot. And of course, we have service members who get deployed downrange into high-risk areas who may not even get any mail. Now, while I emphasize at the beginning the experience of overseas military voters, they're not the only ones experiencing challenges. Even domestic absentee military voters experience barriers. Again, there are mail delivery delays, especially under, say, global pandemic conditions, which we unfortunately witnessed firsthand a few years ago. Additionally, I think it's an important piece of education to share. Summer is what we in the military call PCS season. PCS stands for Permanent Change of Station. And during the summer months are when about a third of our force is in the process of moving from one assignment to the next. And as most elections happen around November, you can imagine that if you are moving in the summer, the expectation that you get your next mailing address in time to efficiently communicate it to your local elected official, wherever they may be, on top of all of the moving logistics, finding a new doctor's office for your family, finding new schools for your kids. This just makes every fall, it is a perennial logistical challenge, even for military families in the United States who are voting absentee to vote in time, which we've seen firsthand. So what happens? What is the upshot of all of this? Well, I believe the state senator already cited the lower participation rate that happens amongst military voters, a 27% deficit, which is a huge gap that we are trying to fill. Now, who are we talking about? We are talking about a percentage of 1% of voters. Only 1% of Americans serve. So it's a relatively small community, which isn't to say that our access problems are small, but that the practical implication of this bill is relatively modest. It is also, and what does this look like in terms of voting participation? It's helpful to share 92% of military spouses are women, and military families are racially representative of the country as a whole. And so these are the voters who are being blocked from getting to exercise their full voting rights. And then I will add one final note here at the end. What you're looking for is bare minimum access to voting. But I also want voters in my community to have the same opportunity as civilian voters to be maximally deliberative about our choices and how we vote by giving us up until election day to cast our ballots. I think it's one thing to say you have to cast your ballot and get it in the mail weeks in advance. What happens if something happens between when I put my ballot in the mail and actual election day? Things could happen that could have changed the way that I wanted to vote. And so I think that's the beauty of the legislation that we're talking about today, is it gives voters like myself just as much time to reflect and be deliberative voters as civilians. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Just want to say, like military voters, voters with disabilities also experience challenges. So to describe the barriers faced at the polling place, I would like to introduce disability advocate Rasheta Bunting. Rasheta.
Thank you. It's an honor for me to be here. Let me turn my screen reader off because as a blind person, it drives me crazy. So yes, my name is Rasheta Bunting and I am a blind disability advocate who resides in Brooklyn, New York, and also a member of the National Federation of the Blind. And I've been voting in every election for the past 30 years. So you guys do the math. But I'm also the child of Southern migrants. My parents instilled in my brother, my sister, and I the importance of voting because they marched in the civil rights era. They fought for voting rights. They grew up doing Jim Crow and segregation. And this is the reason why they migrated from rural North Carolina to New York for a better life for themselves and their families. So when in my home, when we turned 18, you got that hot ticket gift and also a voter registration card. So voting, to not vote in the Bunting household was not an option. So that's why I said I've done it for 30 years, every election, up until the world shut down in 2020. And my parents are seniors now. So now in one household, you have seniors and you have a blind person. Everyone had to fill out for this absentee voting ballot online. And when I was doing it for my parents, I realized that it was not accessible. Long story short, in the interest of time, spoke to some advocates, reached out to the National Federation of the Blind. It led to a litigation, but we're still not happy. We got something, but we need better. So we did get an accessible absentee ballot, but we still had to print it out. And we had to print it out, fold it, sign it, send it back to the Board of Elections. But here's the thing. A lot of blind people don't have printers to print, which means we have to rely on other people, which to see our ballots, take away our independence, which is our federal rights, and to help us print this ballot and fold it. So this is why this electronic ballot return is so important. If we would have had this at the time when the world shut down, myself and my parents would have had the ability to cast our votes privately from the comfort of our homes and the safety of our homes and vote. And I don't know what I'm looking like on time, but that's all that I really have to say on this. Like, this is a very important piece of legislation that we just need to pass, because so many disabled people experience major disenfranchisement and barriers when we do go into the election sites and the poll sites. But like I said, despite all of the barriers that I face as a blind person, I still show up and I still cast my vote. And but there are so many people who don't, and this is why this is important.
Thank you so much for that just powerful story. And I think the barriers that you described, Rasheta, are felt by far too many New Yorkers, leaving the ballot box inaccessible. So to elaborate on the legal implications of our current voting system, I would like to introduce Luann Blake, who is Director of Research Programs at the National Federation of the Blind. Luann.
Thank you, Rebecca. It's a real honor to be part of this legislative briefing. I am a blind voter, and I have been advocating for the rights of blind and low vision voters to vote privately and independently for over 15 years now, as a member of the staff of the National Federation of the Blind. As Senator Hoylman noted, Title II of the ADA requires that voters with disabilities be provided an opportunity to vote privately and independently that is equal to the opportunity afforded to voters without disabilities. And this applies to both in-person voting as well as voting by mail. So what that means when we're talking about voting by mail, that a blind voter or a voter with another print disability must be able to mark their ballot privately and independently and return their ballot privately and independently in a location that's convenient to them, like home or their office, the same as a voter without disabilities can mark their absentee ballot privately and independently and then return it privately and independently. The requirement that a blind voter print out their absentee ballot after they've marked it using an electronic ballot delivery system is a barrier that prevents many blind voters from using that system. Many blind voters don't have printers. When they print it out, they need to put it in an envelope, they need to take it to a Dropbox or put it in the mail. All these barriers prevent blind voters and other voters with print disabilities from having full accessibility when it comes to voting by mail. And also, as was noted, there are about 32 states that permit UOCAVA voters to return their ballots electronically. But currently, there are only 13 states that permit voters with disabilities to return their ballots electronically. And I want to read you the list of those states, and I'm going to read the list that I have here under my CCTV. So those states that permit voters with disabilities to return their ballots electronically are Colorado, Delaware, Hawaii, Indiana, Louisiana, Maine, Massachusetts, Nevada, North Carolina, North Dakota, Rhode Island, Utah, and West Virginia. And I look forward to adding New York to that list. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luann. I'd like to just summarize some of the chat before we move on to our next speaker for folks that want access to it. So we have Maya Barlow over at Senator Hoylman's office, who has offered to reach out if anyone has questions about the legislation. We will be sending along her email in the follow-up for today, as well as Jackson Fisher Ward from the Assemblymember's office with his email. So we'll be sending those emails out at the end. And then for those who are interested, we'll also send in a follow-up, the third piece in the chat here around Rasheta's op-ed about her experience and why this bill is so important. So with that, you know, I think we all here at the table really believe that New York needs to address these challenges and barriers to voting in order to have a democracy that is both equitable and representative. And so our next session here, next piece of this is really to talk about how electronic ballot return works. To speak to the implementation, I would like to introduce Jocelyn Bucaro. Jocelyn is a respected national election expert with over a decade of experience running elections in Ohio and Colorado. She's previously served as the director of elections in Denver. Jocelyn.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you all for your time today. It's wonderful to see so much interest in this legislation, and we are very happy to be a resource to help provide any information about how electronic ballot return can be implemented by election administrators for the voters who would be impacted by this legislation. As Luann just pointed out, the state of Colorado is one of those that already has permitted military and overseas voters, as well as people with disabilities, and also voters in emergency situations to return a ballot electronically. And what does that mean in practice? Well, that means that in the state of Colorado, the Secretary of State's office hosts an online ballot transmission site through which voters can upload an encrypted version of their cast ballot and ballot affidavit. So it still functions like absentee voting for the voter, except they're doing the paper absentee process on a computer or smartphone or other electronic device. Once the ballot is uploaded to the site hosted by the Secretary of State in Colorado, the election officials, which is where I would step in as the director of elections in Colorado with my team, would then be able to access our county's records posted through that site. And we would export the voter's ballot and affidavit and treat it just like a paper absentee ballot, where the signature affidavit would be verified and a paper ballot is generated, basically printed by the election official and then tabulated as if it was an absentee ballot received by mail. So all of the ballots generated through the electronic ballot transmission system ultimately resulted in a paper ballot for tabulation. No tabulation ever took place online. It simply functioned as a transmission service for those voted ballots. So ultimately, instead of asking a voter to print the ballot, the election official was printing the ballot. It worked really well for our voters. Colorado had passed electronic ballot return many years ago and had been offering it as a service for military and overseas voter many years with great success. We saw a lower ballot rejection rate for voters in those situations because the number one reason why voters serving in the military or voters overseas who are successfully able to return a ballot, see their ballot ultimately not get counted, is because it's not received in time. When they have to vote by mail, very often the ballot doesn't arrive back at the election official's office in time to be counted. And so they have a much higher percentage of ballot rejection when they get through all of the other hurdles that Sarah described earlier and actually are able to get that ballot back. In Colorado and in other states that have electronic ballot transmission, we see a much lower ballot rejection rate, sometimes as low as 0.8%, compared to as high as over 17% in states that don't have electronic ballot return. So that was one benefit. We also saw an increase in participation rates among voters who are able to use electronic ballot transmission. So we do see the impact in reducing barriers, and that's true in other states as well. Statistically, states that allow for electronic ballot return among military and overseas voters have a roughly 7% higher rate of successful voting among those voters than in states that do not have electronic ballot return. In 2019, the state of Colorado passed legislation allowing people with disabilities to receive a ballot, an accessible ballot electronically, which is similar to what New York currently offers. And through the 2020 election, at the time, the advocates were advocating for what this bill will do, but the legislature in 2019 in Colorado only went as far as the delivery of a blank absentee ballot to those qualified voters. In 2020, the Secretary of State's office was a great ally in Colorado for the county clerks who were, and the disability community and disability advocates who were interested in seeing full electronic voting for those eligible voters. And we collected survey data from our voters to really understand their experience with transmission on the delivery side without return. And what we found is what Rasheta has already said, that they don't have printers, and so they weren't able to use it. They still had to go to a polling place in 2020 in order to vote because they had no other accessible way of casting a ballot. So, ultimately then in 2021, the Colorado legislature said, okay, we've seen enough. We're going to do the full electronic return. And they passed legislation in 2021 to then allow people with disabilities to return their ballots electronically as well. So I'm happy to answer questions as we move forward through the agenda today. And thank you so much for your time. And thank you to Secure Families Initiative for hosting this.
Thank you, Jocelyn. As an organization made up of military families who vote in New York and throughout the United States, you can understand that election security is extremely important to us. And to speak to the security of electronic return, I'm honored to introduce our next speaker. Say our next and last speaker. Sam Kinch has 20 years of cyber offense operation expertise with the Department of Defense, the intelligence community, and Department of Homeland Security. He served in 2 branches of the military with roles in several defense commands, including founding DoD's Federal COVID Response Technical Security Team for DHS, serving as the National Guard's chief advisor to a U.S. Cyber Command, and providing critical expertise to the Defense Science Board. He was also an NSA exploitation analyst for over 100 cyberspace and intelligence operations. He currently serves as Director of Technical Accounting Management for Titanium, and his decorations and honors are too numerous to list today. It is my pleasure to introduce Sam Kinch.
Thank you, I appreciate it. You guys hear me okay?
Yes, you're all set. Yep.
Awesome, thank you. Good afternoon, thanks. First, I want to thank you for your time. I know it's valuable to all of you, legislative and all of us civilians, normal civilians alike. We all have our time and it's very critical. So thank you for that. As was mentioned, I did retire from the military. It was in 2021, 10 years Army, 20 years Air Force across both active duty, reserves, and National Guard. So I've had my fill of the military in one sense. I absolutely love the time that I served. But as it pertains to this conversation, electronic voting would be critical in any military situation. And it was something that I lacked when I was serving both the Army and the Air Force. My last position, just for a little more background, was as a National Guard advisor to the Commander, U.S. Cyber Command. I was responsible for integrating all aspects of National Guard into Cyber Command's mission. I currently work for a cybersecurity company, so I'm still involved in the fight of cyber. I was offensive and defensive. To those on the line, it just means I basically participated in all aspects of cyber operations as it pertains to defending our homeland. My second tour was with the Army, and this is relevant to the situation here. I actually served in Germany for 5 years. During that time, I was active duty. I was voting in both regional and national elections, but it was a challenging time. The voting process for me at the time was in the era of 1999 to the year 2000. So if you remember back to that time frame, it was Serbia. We were in full conflict with Slobodan Milosevic. The Kosovo crisis was in full swing, and I happened to be deployed to multiple hostile fire areas during that time. If I had had the ability to vote electronically, I can tell you it would have been significantly easier, both in time, energy, but also for the concern for my own safety. I mean, just trying to coordinate and translate where I needed to go to get the forms, to actually not just get the forms, properly fill them out, and then mail them back. And then, as Jocelyn alluded to, many times the mailing of those forms back gets delayed just in the transition from those foreign areas back to the States. It was almost a decision about whether I would even take the time to vote because of the time and energy that was required. I can tell you from a personal perspective, having either mobile or electronic voting capabilities during that time would have been amazing. It would have been pretty much a game changer. And I think that even though we might be only the 1% of voters within our national elections, it is a significant percentage when it comes to how few votes it takes to actually win an election. And we see that both at the regional and the national level. While assigned to U.S. Cyber Command, I also participated in a program that you might or might not be familiar with. It's called the Election Security Group. The Election Security Group operates not just with U.S. Cyber Command, but is a collaboration between the command as well as NSA, and it organizationally focuses efforts to disrupt, deter, and degrade our adversaries, our foreign adversaries' ability to interfere with all aspects or influence our U.S. citizens in how we vote and how those votes are counted. So I guess the question of the day is really, are there risks to voting electronically? And this includes mobile voting. Absolutely. There's always risks. There's risk to me walking down the street and driving my car where I am right now, as I'm in between separate meetings, but there are definitely risks. But can those risks be mitigated is really the question we should be asking. And I believe, yes, they can be, absolutely. In my opinion, one of the biggest benefits to electronic voting is the accessible nature of it. If you asked me 10 years ago about this, when I was sitting in Kosovo, I would have said it's not worth it. It would have been painful and challenging at best. But this day and age, everyone has a cell phone. Everyone has a computer or access to it, either from your library or from your home. Even those who aren't old enough to vote yet have cell phones. That's a testament to how pervasive that technology is. Question is, can you secure it in a way that ensures the confidentiality and the integrity of our votes? And yes, you can. But I want to talk to a couple of the risks, because you're probably wanting to pull a thread a little bit on that, as well as some of the mitigations that I've seen that we can utilize for that effort. Security of the infrastructure. So that includes like the internet voting systems. Could they be subject to hacking? Yes, absolutely. So DEF CON is a cybersecurity conference in Las Vegas that happens every year. They have a hacking village, electronic, basically an election voting hacking village that is focused on breaking our election systems to better improve the security of them. Can they be hacked? Sure. But the ability to actually conduct those ongoing penetration tests, as well as risk assessments, I think that's where we can mitigate some of the threats that might be there. Can votes be changed or lost or deleted? Yes, they can. But those risks are also present in our current system of paper ballots, as we've seen quite clearly through some of the most recent elections. Mitigations for how to mitigate the threats that I've outlined, at least from a security perspective. Obviously, the basic cyber hygiene of our infrastructure and our people is probably the most critical thing we can do. That is everything from strong passwords to encryption. And that's not just encryption of the actual votes themselves, but the actual transmission of those votes across the internet, as well as the actual security of the voting platforms themselves. I will say that there are quite a few proven cases, use cases of electronic voting around the world, not just for electronic voting, but for secure electronic voting, including electronic returns and mobile voting platforms. Some of those capabilities also use blockchain to even help ensure the integrity of the votes being cast. Number two, I guess the second thing I would point out was internet voting systems could be used to commit voter fraud. For example, someone could, vote multiple times or vote under someone else's name. However, from an electronic perspective, this is another area that is, I wouldn't say it's easy, but it's definitely not as difficult as people make it out to be. And that is requiring voters to provide identification and verify who they are, or verify bits of information that they might only know to identify them as a single user. Securing the cryptography on the election system and how that system talks to itself, how those votes transmit through that system. That's an important mitigation that we can absolutely, especially in this day and age, where cryptography is everything. In fact, almost every website you go to, you have to put in not just HTTP anymore, it's HTTPS to ensure that the site is encrypted. And then additionally, you can also use digital signatures to help verify those votes. The digital signature is specific to a unique person. It's unique information that identifies that person is the only one that cast the vote because of unique information they provided. They have now a unique signature that can be used to identify them so that votes don't get cast twice. And to ensure that somebody did vote or did not vote. Number three, I would say it's difficult to ensure the accuracy of internet voting results. And this is a risk that's out there. It's not necessarily that there is a problem here, but I would say that this is because it can be difficult to verify that votes cast are valid and that they have not been tampered with. That said, mitigations of this include requiring voters to verify their votes before submitting them, ensuring you have a system that allows you to not just cast your vote, but verify that the votes being cast are the ones that you actually submitted. You could even do this through a third-party system, so you can have a secondary, it's almost like going to a doctor where you have an assessment of a particular physical ailment, and then you go to another doctor to verify that that assessment is accurate. We can do the same thing in electronic voting to help mitigate that concern and help ensure that the votes you cast are the votes that you wanted to cast. The other thing we can do as well is, paper trails and auditing of results is essential. You can do that in obviously a paper form, but on the electronic voting or mobile voting side of the house, that's bread and butter to what electronic systems can do. Having a trail of evidence to ensure that what you voted is what came out the other end is essential and extremely viable as an option. Despite the risks and some of the mitigations I've outlined, I do think ultimately that the benefits greatly outweigh the risks. Accessibility of votes and of voting platforms are key to ensuring an increase in the number of votes across the sector. And this minimization let's not use that word. Let's say that the people that are usually the most critical in this perspective are the ones that struggle the most because of either a disability or because they're deployed overseas, and that could be military, it could be an expat who's over there as well. It could be a person that's away from their home state because they're traveling or vacationing someplace else, but they still want to vote. Being able to flip open your phone and vote in a secure way and know that your vote counted improves the morale, but also the security of our nation. It also mitigates a lot of the discussions and debates that we continue to have about whether votes are counted correctly. So yes, I do believe the benefits will outweigh the risks, that the mitigations I've outlined will further drive down the risk to a point where electronic voting, particularly with mobile devices, does become quite tenable for our nation. With that, I know I've rambled on for quite a while, but I'll turn it back over to Jocelyn or the other team for further comments. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sam. I really appreciate both you elaborating on the mitigation, but also talking about how, when disenfranchisement does happen to voters, how that's also a threat to the security of the election. So thank you for hitting on both of those points. We're now going to move on to our question and answer period. So again, to respect the time of our panelists and our participants, we're going to be limiting questions to the legislation that we're speaking to today. We'll start, I don't know if there's any questions in the chat, but if folks want to start formulating those, feel free to throw a question in the chat. We'll also kick it off with a question. If you would like to ask a verbal question, just put your hand up and we'll call on you in the best order I can see on the screen. So to start off the first question, I want to kick it over to Jocelyn Bucaro. And Jocelyn, on the implementation side, can you elaborate on how State Board of Elections will know if a voter qualifies for electronic return?
Sure, it's a great question, and it often comes up in these legislative discussions, particularly around people with disabilities and knowing how election officials can determine if a voter qualifies. So with military and overseas voters, it's fairly simple. They already register as qualified UACAVA voters under the federal legislation that enables them to vote by absentee ballot in federal elections. There is a flag that is present in every voter record for any voter who qualifies under the federal UACAVA law. So when voters register to vote or are changing their address or doing any interaction with the voter registration system and the election official, that flag would be present and the voter would automatically be eligible, and therefore the election official can automatically determine whether or not they're qualified to return that ballot electronically. With voters with disabilities, the way it has been implemented in every state that I'm aware of is through the affidavit. Voters will attest in an affidavit when they are applying to receive an absentee ballot that they have a qualifying disability. And when they return that ballot, they similarly attest or execute an affidavit swearing, typically under penalty of election falsification, which depending on the jurisdiction is either a felony or a misdemeanor offense, that they qualify and have a qualifying disability. So no election official is ever asking for a doctor's note or any kind of other evidence that a voter qualifies. It is through the attestation process.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'll open it up, see if anyone else online has any questions. Okay, I see a question in the chat. Would this legislation permit only overseas military voters or all UACAVA voters to use electronic ballot return in New York State? See if the senators and assemblymen are still on, and if not, I can be prepared to answer that. Okay, so the legislation that we have currently that was introduced this session would apply to all military voters. So those would be voters who are active duty service members or their families, and voters with print disabilities.
All military voters who are voting absentee, it should be noted.
Any other questions? Any hope for the rest of us? So actually, this was a great question. Again, this legislation would, as Sarah mentioned earlier, apply to only a very small percentage of New York voters. And I'm actually going to turn that over to her to talk a little bit about our coalition's perspective, both on this legislation and then voting, electronic voting more broadly.
Thanks, Rebecca. And thank you for the question. In short, the legislation we're speaking about today, like we've said, is a narrow slice. And it's out of a recognition of the acute barriers experienced by this population of voters in particular. I also want to share from the chat that Michael Ramos specified too. When we talk about UACAVA, Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act, this is the federalized language that puts together absentee military voters and citizens overseas. This would extend to the family members of service members. So like myself, I'm the spouse of an active duty service member, and my family is getting stationed overseas starting this fall. So I am going to shortly be in this category, even though I have also voted absentee from the continental US. But anyway, this legislation does not extend electronic ballot return to any New York voter. And we would encourage New York to make down the road a decision on whether to extend it that way or not. But the focus for today is on treating the most acute need in the meantime, out of a recognition of it being done successfully in a number of other states, as we've discussed.
I think it's important to note, though, that even though this is a small slice, that this also builds a framework for success that actually will bleed over. Because I think when people find that there are secure ways to vote and that some people within their state are, they're more likely to step up and say, we want that too. So I think this is a huge step in the right direction, even though it seems like a small chunk of the pie.
Thank you so much. I'm just looking through our audience here to see if there's any other questions. Okay. Well, as we reach the hour, we'll be concluding our briefing for the afternoon. I think the short amount of questions probably speaks to how robust and efficient all of our panelists were. So thank you so much for everyone who joined us on the panel, for our speakers today, for the support of Senator Hoylman and Assemblymember Epstein and their teams. And we'll be in touch with all who attended the recording. I'm sorry, all that attended today with the recording of today's briefing and some additional resources. Again, feel free to reach out if you have any additional questions, and a member of our team would be happy to connect you to the right person. Thank you all for joining us today, and have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.